Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Hello and welcome. My name's Alison Stewart and I'm your host for this episode of Cut the Crop. And once again, we have an overseas speaker coming on to give us some great insights. And we have Fiona Burnett from Scotland's Rural College, based just out of Aberdeen in Scotland. Welcome, Fiona.
Thanks, Alison.
And Fiona's very well known to FAR and arable growers. She's been over to New Zealand and been keynote speaker in our conferences. So it's great to talk to you again, Fiona. And today we're going to talk about fungicide resistance, which is a topic close to your heart. So let's just do a little bit of a summary of some of the main cereal issues around, fungicide resistance in the UK.
Well, I could probably fill your whole slot with a list of problems, but if I maybe highlight a few, for wheat, clearly, if Septoria is taken as our major pathogen, then the kind of key issues around declines in the azoles, developing issues with the SDHI chemistry, and obviously resistance in the strobilurians. They're probably the two most problematic issues that we have there. But kind of important, we have a few other pathogens like mildew and tan spot in wheat that also carry resistance problems. So it's not all about Septoria. We also have resistance issues in microdochiums and fusariums. And then if we look at barley, again, we have issues across many of the diseases there. So we have issues with SDHIs, strobilurians and azoles in net blotch, declines in Rhynchosporium to some of the azoles, Ramilaria, which is featured in another of your podcasts, has really a terrible record of developing resistance to most major pathogens. So at the minute, really, the azoles are the only ones that are active. But then maybe a few other ones to touch on. That loose smuts become more problematic for us in Scotland, and some of that's based on declines in azole efficacy. So it's just that feeling that we have a myriad of resistance problems across the cereals. And it's tricky.
So, obviously, there is a huge amount of work then that needs to be done around stewardship of these chemicals. Like, how do we keep them performing for as long as possible? Just talk me through some of the sort of stewardship options that you've developed and that, that the growers are implementing.
Yeah, absolutely. Stewardship is key. And I'm often pressed to kind of pick what's the best one. And I think my highlight would always be, we don't have to pick just one thing to do. It's about doing as many different things as we can. But at its core, it's pretty simple. It's about just reducing reliance on any one particular active, because if we rely on any one thing, it creates a massive selective advantage to any individuals in that pathogen population that develop resistance. So that's really at the core of it, reducing reliance on any one active. And then to actually put that into practice, what we're trying to do is either reduce the dose, to reduce the number of times we use it, so maybe by alternating, and to diversify, to try and mix and use as many different solutions in the programme. And by solutions, I'm not just meaning fungicide solutions, I'm meaning, any other integrated pest management practices. So again, reducing reliance, more resistant varieties, anything you can do to just reduce the disease pressure in the first place is going to be really helpful. So there's a whole lot of things that can be done. And again, if I'm pressed to say which ones are the most practical, then mixing is just one of the really, really simple things that can be done at the point of application. And again, there tend to be win-wins for users at that point, because you're probably getting a greater spectrum of activity and you're also helping to manage resistance risks. So kind of, why would you not do it?
So when you talk about actives, do the growers in the UK, have they got a good understanding of, it's not the product, it's the active ingredient, and it's the category of active that you're talking about? Are they're familiar with the fungicide resistance categories?
No, that's an interesting point. So probably not as familiar as we would like. And that kind of, yes, explaining that chemistry sits in distinct families and just mixing different products that actually are all SDHIs or are all azoles, that's not likely to be very helpful. So yeah, probably still work to do to go. Again, if we think of wheat, it's about trying to think between those major families of chemistries, if you like. So azoles being very different to SDHIs, being very different to strobilurins, and to being very different to, we now have a QII in a trek in the mix as well. So yeah, no, that's a really powerful message to try and convey.
So do you get any cross resistance across the chemical groups? I mean, I wasn't aware of any, but I mean, I'm not in this space. So are we picking up any cross resistance?
No, I mean, a very limited example. So generally that thing of mixing between different groups is a good way of ensuring that you don't get cross resistance. Occasionally you get kind of incomplete cross resistance within groups. So for example, some of the azoles select slightly differently, and there can be a kind of interesting piece there about whether you diversify something like the azoles, but that's actually quite a weak resistance strategy or anti-resistance strategy compared to genuinely mixing between different groups where we don't see that cross resistance. So again, that's a really good and powerful message to convey.
So what is the best means that you've found to be able to support growers in understanding how to be able to develop, a crop protection program that is, I suppose, minimizing the risk of resistance building up? Do you give guidance on mixing and matching certain fungicides, or are you relying on the chemical companies to sort of provide that information when they're selling their products?
I mean, we work closely with chemical companies, but absolutely that independent piece about what works is key. And for me, it's very much about keeping the messages as simple as we can, because this doesn't need to be complex. So for growers, the kind of reducing the dose and using mixtures are just two very practical, doable ways of stewarding products on farm. So we try and produce, I mean, I work with the Fungicide Resistance Action Group UK, which is just an independent grouping of researchers working with the chemical companies and the regulator to just agree what the key messages are each season and at the key timings, and just to make them practical. So what would you do at T1? Well, we would try and use mixtures. We would promote the fact that you try and balance, if you're mixing an SDHI and an azole, that each one is supporting the other, and you do that in a balanced way. We're really strong on the message that reducing the dose when it comes to fungicide stewardship is a good thing. And again, for growers, there's win-wins there, that you're saving a bit of cost and you're also helping to steward a product. So again, I think we always try and focus on the win-wins. There are plenty like that example of using mixtures and reducing doses that are a win to an individual grower, but are also helpful collectively in stewarding against resistance.
So I'm really interested in, the whole issue of the dose. When you're saying reduce the dose, are you talking about within a range of, activity, or are you talking about actually taking a dose that falls outside the label claim?
The dose, I always think, is the ultimate decision for the person in the field. So absolutely, I accept you're doing you're using the dose you need to do the job, but you don't need to use any more than you need. So in a low pressure year where perhaps situation's dry, you've got a resistant variety, we could come right down the dose to, perhaps to half dose in wheat at an early timing. But I'm very reluctant to pin a dose because, like I say, that's the decision for the person judging the risk in the field. But the principle being that you don't want to be using any more than you need to use. And again, if we go back to the mixing principle, you can get to the same level of control by mixing 2 low doses. You get the same control in the field, but you're using a low dose of each individual active. So there's a sensible kind of risk management piece there, and possibly cost savings. We don't, the label claim for us in the UK is very much about the maximum that you can use. And within that, we're at liberty to use what we want. But I come back to the point, we're using these fungicides as tools to do a job that we need done. But within that, just using no more than you need is just, for me, such a sensible way to steward.
Yeah. So what about the role of the multi-site? I mean, obviously, that's actually quite crucial.
So the multi-sites are a nice piece where, again, at any point, if you can minimise the use of the very high-risk actives, so things like the strobilurins, for example, we always knew were at high risk of resistance. The multi-sites are at the other end of that risk spectrum because it's very hard for pathogens to develop resistance. So, for example, Fulpit has now become one of our key multi-sites in cereal programs. So the principle that you try and maximise the use of the multi-site, which is very low risk, and then you minimize the use of your other actives. So if we bring that full circle to think about, well, you might be using an SDHI and azole mix on wheat. If you support that with Fulpit, you're probably going to be able to use a slightly lower dose of those high-risk actives. And even if you don't, you're still making it that bit harder for the pathogen to evolve resistance because it's not being overexposed to just the SDHI or just the azole. So yeah, absolutely, multi-sites are a very key tool in managing resistance risk.
And so you mentioned earlier on in the podcast that, I guess the risk of losing the efficacy of a new product, that if it's misused, you could potentially, lose its efficacy within 2 to 3 seasons. So is that the reality that, that if you bring a new chemical on into the cereal market and it's not got, a completely new resistance mechanism, that if you're not stewarding it, that you're putting at risk that will fall over in 2 to 3 seasons?
Yes, no, and I think there's much better awareness now of the risks of products that come onto the market. Like we've now got fenpicoxamide, which has arrived already flagged as being at high risk. So for us, that's available as Inatrek. So you can only use it once. It can only be used in a supported mixture. So it's in with a strong azole, and we would support it with a multi-site as well. So that's the way it's come to market already, with that really strong message that you can't use it at 3 or 4 timings, as we did with azoles, and that you have to support it. And that's positive that that's now seen as a way of just, learning from previous bad examples, where we've, I remember the strobilurins where we were so excited about them, and they were used straight, they were used at high doses, they were used repeatedly, and lo and behold, we developed problems. So I really do hope we've learned from that. And you've touched on IPM in other podcasts, but again, just that recognition that resistant varieties and other factors can really help reduce pressure on that new chemistry.
Yeah, and if you're a chemical company, that's a big challenge, because we know how expensive it is to bring, a new chemical to market. And, the risk of then, losing its efficacy within 2 to 3 seasons, and you haven't even remotely got a return on your investment at that point. You can understand how chemical companies will be really reticent about bringing products onto the market if they have that very high, resistance risk.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's to some extent surprising that we still have new actives arriving. It's long odds and high risk. But yeah, I think that it is encouraging that they arrive with better resistance management packages built in, and that there's a more collective will to try and work with that. But yeah, the marketing pressure to just try and use it as quickly as we can must be huge.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you were a member of the Fungicide Resistance Action Group. Maybe just talk to us about, what you do in that group and how it links to, the international network.
I just think that that's an example of a group where it's just so useful to share the experience, share the evidence, and then to look more internationally about what other people are finding. So, the Fungicide Resistance Action Group UK looks at the seasonal monitoring information, what we know about the different diseases and the state of sensitivity or resistance. And then we try and develop collective advice that people can really get behind because it's evidenced and it's agreed, and that nobody's kind of undermining it with counter messages and kind of casting doubt on it. So I think that kind of consistency in messaging is really key. And I just, it's so useful to work more internationally with yourselves at FAR, with others. There are active groups in Japan, Europe, all around the world, really, where again we can share that kind of collective evidence on literature. The dose rate piece, for example, used to be controversial and is now just so well accepted and is now working through into really practical recommendations. So yeah, that's the type of discussions that we would have at a group like FRAG. And yeah, I just think it's a really good collective forum. And for us, the other piece is that we can work with the regulator to think about what label recommendations might be put onto products as well. And again, we refer to it as the grey stewardship, which is the more voluntary stuff. And the very word grey implies there's a kind of sliding scale there. And then there's the absolute black and white. If something is significant enough that it needs to be on the label, like, for example, you can only use it once or you can only use it twice, then again, that's a really useful thing to go, that's just the way it is. That product comes out with that really stern kind of this is what it says in the tin and this is how you'll use it.
So just finishing up, what would be some, key messages that you would have based on your experiences in the UK for New Zealand growers?
I think taking it seriously, but I know you do that anyway. So resistance is recognised as a problem. There's no kind of, lavish pipeline of new products. We're lucky to have some new products arriving, but everybody's much more aware that we need to steward them. And I think there's plenty of those simple win-wins, and that I think is a shared experience between the UK and New Zealand. So kind of, again, it just goes back to having a diversity of actives and programs, using those balanced mixtures. Don't get obsessed about just picking one stewardship measure, is alternating better than mixing. It doesn't matter, do both if you can. So I think those would be the kind of, probably sound fairly simple messages, but, I go back to the thing, this doesn't have to be complex. There's plenty of pretty simple things we can do to help steward against fungicide resistance, which everybody recognises as a real problem. We see that, farmers are seeing that, you're seeing it, that we do not get the control from some of the products that we used to get.
Are there any multi-site products coming back onto the market? You tend to think of multi-sites being old technology, but I'm just interested to know whether the chemical companies that are actually looking at bringing some multi-sites back onto the market.
I suspect, right, a lot of what we have is old school. It's the mancozebs, the sulfurs, the fulpits. I think now the recognition, though, that because of the other environmental effects that you're likely to get with multi-sites, the regulatory hurdles will be so high that the chances of getting one that's multi-site, but only multi-site on pathogens are pretty slim. So we live in hope, but I suspect not. No.
I might just finish up because, I look at this as part of a sort of whole integrated package. Where does the UK sit with allowing genetically modified technology? Are you able to get new cultivars that have been, gene edited or that are genetically modified for resistance? Or are you still in a similar situation to New Zealand where we don't have access to that technology?
It's the same here. So huge interest in that as a technology, but nothing commercially available yet. Some research ongoing on the subject. And I think a recognition that, yes, more rapid breeding programs, even the term genetic modification is fairly clunky now. So there are more sophisticated ways of tailoring, programs and, bringing in genes more rapidly. But I come back to the thing that if the hope is that we then develop a very simple tool, it'll be just like fungicide resistance. If we breed a resistant variety based on a very simple gene that we've included, and we'll break that as well. So balance in all things.
Yeah, and I think that is a really important point to sort of finish on. And it comes back to that comment I made before about learning from the lessons, lessons from our mistakes of the past, that when you think there's a silver bullet and you just keep using, one measure, eventually it will break down. And therefore that whole, sort of more holistic, more whole system, multiple integrated program is really the only sustainable option. And the sooner we buy into that philosophy, the better for everyone.
Absolutely subscribe to that. Yep.
Thank you very much, Fiona. You've done three podcasts with us, so we're really appreciative of you sort of providing some of your insight from the UK. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Alison.
Yeah, and thank you, listeners. Have a great day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.